If you're a working bass player, or if you aspire to be a working bass player, and you want to play in one of those high-energy dance function bands that makes all that moolah, then you may have considered playing synth bass on the songs that have it. Now, yes, there are other options like bass guitar synth pedals, but before I go any further, let me talk about my own journey down the synth bass path. Now, I started playing bass professionally in the earlier part of the 1980s, and back then, gigs were 5 nights a week, and professional cover band bass player was an actual job title. And being a professional cover band bass player was a cool job to have back then, because it had a lot of perks. Plus, to this day, it's still the only job that I know of where you can not only drink alcohol while you're working, but sometimes the person that hired you encouraged it. As long as it wasn't in excess, but I'll save those stories for another time. Now, the bands that I worked in were called Top 40 bands, and it was called this because their ever-changing song list was the top 40 songs off of Billboard's Hot 100 song chart. And you older folks remember, this was the same chart that Casey Kasem used to count down the American Top 40.
American Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem, and you're listening to American Top 40, counting them down to the number one song. But before I get to the number one song, I have a long-distance dedication, and it says, Dear Casey, my son Rib13 is a professional top 40 bass player. Will you please play George Thorogood's Get a Haircut and Get a Real Job? Love, Mom. So an interesting phenomena that was happening when I started playing professionally was a lot of those songs on the charts had synthesizer bass. The problem was that there was a lot of songs that were going lower than the low E on my bass guitar. Now remember, professional cover band bass player was a pretty good job to have back then. And as such, there was always musicians out there gunning for my job. And some of those guys were excellent singers, and they looked like this. So one thing all working musicians pretty much did back then was make themselves more valuable. And the more points you had in your resume, the more job security you had. And having the ability to cover synth bass songs was a big plus. And there was 2 main options that bass players back then could choose, each having its own set of benefits and drawbacks. One of these was this new thing called the 5-string bass with a low B string, which allowed bass players to cover the notes of a synth bass song, but not necessarily get the sound. The second option was to play bass synthesizer on stage, which allowed you to get the sound, but you had more gear to set up. I opted to play synth bass on stage. Now, one of the first keyboards that I used for synth bass was the Korg Poly 800, which I affectionately nicknamed the Mosquito because just about everything it did sounded like a mosquito. Here's the piano, here's the strings, here's the choir, and here's a synth bass. Making the decision to play synth bass on stage was actually a very good choice because it started me down the road of learning how to play keyboards. And there's been a couple times in my life where I gigged as a keyboard player, all thanks to starting on synth bass. There's several reasons why this was a good choice. The first is perspective, because playing a different instrument in a band situation allows you to hear the bass from the perspective of the other players. And hearing the bass this way often made me reflect about how I would play those parts on bass. And sometimes I would make changes when I went back to bass. Another great reason was format. You see, a bass neck will often have multiple places to play one note, but a keyboard only gives you one option. And it forces you to think a little bit different about how you want to play a lick or a chop. And this leads into the best reason, which is techniques. And I apply a lot of keyboard techniques to my bass playing. One of these techniques is honky-tonk piano. You see, one of the things that makes a stringed instrument sound country or bluesy is having the ability to be able to bend a note. Well, back in the old days, a piano player couldn't do that, so they had to devise a technique that simulated it. And one of the prime ingredients for honky-tonk piano is called the roll-off or roll-on. And I'm going to give you a basic example of what I'm talking about here. A major chord is made up of a root, a major third, and a perfect fifth. And if you play it on a keyboard, it sounds like this. Not very bluesy. Well, piano players learned a long time ago that if they strike an adjacent note and roll on to the intended target note, it can simulate the bend of a stringed instrument. See, that sounds way more bluesier. Now in this case, I was going from a flat third to a third, but you can also do it flat 5 to 5, or both. Now in the case of a chord that utilizes a black key, you could do a roll up. In this case, it's a D major. And the end result gives you a very bluesy sound. So I decided to try honky-tonk piano-style chops on bass. For example, a while back I did a review of Harley Benton's JP45OP, and in the fingers demo portion, I did a lick that sounded like this. This lick comes directly from honky-tonk piano playing. And I would have never come up with this lick for bass had I not played keyboards. And I would have never played keyboards had I not played synth bass. Now yes, effects pedals like synth bass pedals are an option. There are bass players who have great working knowledge about how to use effects pedals and they get good results. Well, I'm not one of them. My experience trying to use a synth bass pedal is that they are pretty unforgiving, and I felt like I was playing on eggshells in order to play precisely enough to get them to track right. Then you have the issue of making sure that the levels are correct so you don't drive the sound man crazy. But the main thing is that it defeats the purpose of everything else that I explained earlier in this video. I'm Rib13, thanks for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. A big thank you to my Patreon supporters, Derek and Joe, and I'll see you next time.